This podcast is brought to you by CDkeyoffer.com. Use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% on all Microsoft software. And then it is also brought to you by JLC PCB. Get a $10 coupon for Flex PCBs at the link in the description. We'll talk about these sponsors more later. But for now, let's just get on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I am joined by somebody that when I reached out to him to come on the show, I couldn't believe it had already been a year, even though we had spoken offline about some things that developed with Sony with me last year. It didn't occur to me that actually all of 2024, I had not had this guest on, even though he's one of my favorite people to have on. So please introduce yourself. Tell everybody why you're probably my favorite guest to come on every now and then. And then a question I have is, what continues to make you want to do content for YouTube, despite having a successful, career as a lawyer?
Those are all great questions. I don't know if I know the answer to all of them. I'm Rick Hoeg of Hoeg Law. Folks can see me regularly contributing to Last Stand Media. I'm also one of the hosts of the Bitcast for Seasoned Gaming every Sunday, and occasionally still get to do my own videos on the Hoeg Law YouTube channel. But it's very nice of you to say that I am a preferred guest over here. I do think that 2024 was a tricky year for me to do any kind of content delivery because of my stroke in 2022. And you were very gracious to let me say when you asked me on, I don't think I can do something this month. I don't think I can do something this quarter. And ultimately, as it turned out, in 2024. So I'm very happy to be here. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on in the technology and law space, and we're going to talk about much of it as best we can.
All right. So I kind of wanted to start, I guess, would it be a palate cleanser, a palate primer, just to see where we go from there. How do you see the gaming landscape in 2025? Obviously, we're going to get into like tariffs a lot and legal questions, but I know you, which probably isn't a surprise as you being a lawyer, you have a lot of opinions about everything, and I'm sure you have a lot you'd want to say about, from my perspective, Xbox is done, Sony's dominant, Nintendo, I am coming to the opinion, although I like the design of the Switch 2 from a hardware perspective, that they're completely fumbling this launch in a very 3DS way, is my opinion. There's Windows handhelds. Valve is apparently going to challenge Windows, supposedly. Nvidia is being challenged by AMD. A lot is changing. How would you say the gaming market looks to you right now?
Yeah, there's no question that there's a lot of change. I have said for a number of years that I don't love kind of the risk aversion of the AAA gaming landscape because they're spending so much money on products that they're having to find different ways to somehow curtail the risk that they're taking on with that money expenditure. Microsoft has decided that they're going to go into the business of essentially third-party publishing everywhere that they can think of their games. And yes, that means that the Xbox is not as an attractive plastic piece of hardware under your TV. I do think Microsoft is pretty well invested in continuing in the space in that publisher capacity. Sony is winning the hardware race hands down. The question is whether winning that hardware race is going to matter over the medium or long term. I love my Switch. I love Nintendo in general, even though they are some of the more draconian legal beasts in the gaming space. I love their actual product line. I think they have some of the best developers on earth. I was super excited for the Nintendo 2 Direct until it happened. And then I really have my doubts about Nintendo's current leadership and direction. I remember watching the Direct and thinking when they said that really apparent pack-in product, their Welcome Tour piece of software, was going to be a paid addition to the Nintendo Switch 2 launch lineup, that they had lost the plot for what they were selling. I really didn't change my opinion on that when they didn't release pricing information on their video, when they let everybody on the internet decide exactly what the pricing was going to be and have rumors go about everywhere. I think they lack a strong hand at the wheel. Does that matter in the short term? No. Does that matter in the medium term? Maybe. I have less faith in Nintendo as a company going forward than I did before the Direct a couple weeks ago. I still think I'm going to love my Switch 2. I still think I'm going to love most of the products that Nintendo makes for it. but I don't love how weak their leadership is seeming on this, trying to avoid questions about pricing, including tariff questions that we're going to talk about today. And I think it's going to be a massively successful product, primarily because it's a successor to a massively successful product. But we're never going to see the alternate reality where Nintendo launched a Switch 2 that should have been a fairly smooth launch. It's the Switch, but better. And they seem to be fumbling a lot of that messaging right now.
Yeah, I mean, they're finally calling something a 2. They're not like the Wii U or trying to do something weird with the name. They're like, we know we were successful, and this is a continuation of that success. And it's funny the confusion you said about pricing, because I did a small rant on a live stream I did last week about the pricing. And my girlfriend has a Switch. She loves her Switch, and she was excited to get a Switch too. And much like you said, though, once she saw the really rumored pricing for games, it turns out, because I mixed up the names of, the prices of some of the games. Although, so apparently, I believe Mario Kart World is $80, which is still a lot, I believe, for Mario Kart.
That's the one we have confirmed. The only piece of generosity I will give to Nintendo on this is that there is a certain amount of incentive for pricing the launch pack-in game a little bit higher than you might think, because it makes the launch pack-in package look more valuable, right? If Mario Kart World is $80, then who isn't just spending the extra $50 to get it packed into their system that they're now buying? So there is a certain amount of kind of economics of business that goes along with pricing it specifically at that price or another premium price for that product itself. So whatever Doug Bowser says, put that in a bucket. That's not really what's happening. It's not necessarily a Nintendo's looking at variable pricing algorithms for everything. This is a specific moment in time, and that game makes sense from a business perspective, the accountant's perspective, not the consumer's perspective, to say we're going to put a big number on this because we really want you buying that pack-in game package of Nintendo Switches. We really don't want you just buying a naked Switch.
Yeah, well, but again, it's funny. After she saw the Nintendo Direct, she's like, well, if the games are going to cost this much, if the Switch 2 is going to cost this much, a couple of years ago, I got her a gaming PC. This is really a mini PC, but it's, maybe slightly weaker than a PS5, and she's still perfectly happy playing Hogwarts Legacy on that. And she's looking at the Switch 2 and going, well, the performance is what you said it would be, Tom, but, I don't think any of us expected $80 games. And what does this mean moving forward? Like, do I really want to rebuy Hogwarts to see how it looks on a Switch 2? And a point I made, again, in that live stream I did last week was, well, she is the perfect person that should be wanting the Switch 2. And it's like I've said, like with the Nvidia 5090 that is getting panned right now. I am a enthusiast gamer that would use it for productivity in a desktop. I am the target market for this expensive graphics card. If I don't like it, I think they did something wrong. Like, it should be a home run. Of course I'm buying it, And if she doesn't like the Switch 2 anymore, or she's having second thoughts, that means they've fumbled quite a bit, wouldn't you say?
I would, actually. And I use as my example, my daughter was in the room for this. She got up early to watch this Direct, which is unlike her. She was excited about it. And part of this messaging, not just fumbling on price and some of the details and making us pay for the welcome tour and that kind of thing. She was unhappy that they had focused so much of their attention on third-party software. That's not why she comes to the Nintendo party. She had hoped for more announcements that were in the Mario and Zelda and Animal Crossing vein, and left disappointed, which is not what you want your main demographic to feel when the video ends. So I have issues with the strategy for the last couple of years at Nintendo. I have issues with the way they talked about their pricing. I really like the Switch 2 as a product. It seems like a good product that's going to be a big jump up from the Switch 1. So I'm happy with that. I'm even okay with the pricing for the system. I know people were maybe offended by it not being $400. I thought it was always going to come in a little bit higher than that. I think it might come in higher still after we get through this tariff conversation, depending on what they want to do. But that doesn't bother me as much as things like the Mario Kart World price being leaked out because they didn't have control of their own message. And so
everything about the Switch 2 has been leaked out, though, because they've been sitting on launching this thing that was clearly ready for years. And there were rumors that they were mad that there wasn't rumors. They said it publicly. They were mad they had to do that teaser early.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's sitting in warehouses for a year, man. Of course it's going to leak out.
Yeah, not only that, I think one of our questions today might be about CES. And I think there's pretty clear indications that they didn't have protection for trade secrets after CES. And that makes a lot of sense to me from a corporate law perspective. If I were building in third-party accessories for the Nintendo Switch 2 line of products, one of the things I would say is we can't just sit idly by quiet at a major trade show. So we're going to have that as an outdate. And we can talk about that more specifically when we get to that question.
Wait, let me ask you now. Clean
yeah.
Sweep writes in and says, during CES 2025, we saw a lot of third-party vendors show off Switch 2 accessories. Would that count as a breach of some sort of contract or NDA, or did the vendors have some sort of counter-argument that Nintendo felt was too strong to litigate against? It was odd to see Nintendo not attempt to litigate something like this.
Yes, and I think it's a great question. It's something I talked about a little bit while it was happening. And my answer to that is no, there's not a great argument. What happens with these things is you agree to keep trade secret information quiet, you sign NDAs, you sign other types of confidentiality documents with a partner, and you agree to keep it confidential until that company makes it public. That's what we usually see, is you have all these announcements after something like the Direct, which we did see online. Or if you're in the business of making consumer electronics, you say, all right, I'll keep it quiet as long as you need me to keep it quiet, but not past date X, not past the date when I need to have a booth running at this show, because I do other things than make cameras for your video game console. And I am not going to just have half of my productive capacity used to make things for your infrastructure and not be able to tell my consumers and ultimately my investors that that's what I've been doing with their money.
Right.
So it seems to me like all of the contracts would have agreed to that anybody involved with CES was going to have some kind of out like that. Any decent lawyer is going to look at what my client actually needs to do with this and say, we cannot be quiet for that period of time. My guess, and I said this at the time, is that Nintendo thought that their announcement would be before that. And so the lawyers say, yeah, you can agree to anything that's after. We would have made it public anyway, because who cares at that point? And then it slipped. I don't know why it slipped. I'm not in the room. I don't know what they were doing behind the scenes. It slipped into a later period of time than CES 2025. And when those announcements happen, yeah, you can be upset. You can be gritting your teeth if you're Nintendo. But chances are, in order to get those contracts done in the first place, you agreed to an outdate that is now lapsed. And that's why this is happening. And you're not suing anybody. Shorter answer to that question is, if Nintendo had a contract right to sue people, they would have sued them.
Knowing them. Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's funny, too. I'm sure most of the people that listen to this from the Moore's Law is Dead community will already know what I'm talking about. And we've actually seen this in the PC gaming space a lot. But I'd say if anyone came from your channel right now and is listening, we just dealt with this in the PC gaming community early this year. AMD did this last minute delay of the RX 9070 XT. It's actually so comical. It was already in storerooms at Micro Centers for months until they finally released it. And at, I believe, CES, they showed off this year. There were all of these like Asus, and MSI showing off their versions of the graphics card, despite not being able to tell you what the graphics card was. And that is the way me and my co-host just talked about is what a miscommunication. Clearly, this proves AMD planned to announce it at CES or something. But I never considered, too, that like, oh, yeah, but like these companies, Asus makes tons of things, so not as much for them. But like Sapphire mostly makes graphics cards. They had to show off, even if they couldn't tell you what it was, because anyone with a financial stake in that company needs to see proof their company's been doing something all this time.
They need to be making something. And these companies have obligations to the people whose money they take to make things. And so, yes, sometimes lawyers screw that up. I don't think anybody necessarily screwed anything up with respect to the CES leaks. I really think it was a matter of reality intruding on what the contract world looked like, which is to say, I think Nintendo signs up to those dates because they think that they've already launched or at least informed the public of the Switch 2. I mean, Nintendo was trying to keep the Switch 2's existence under wraps for a ridiculously long period of time until it started talking about the successor to the Switch and things like that. And so it was a really weird rollout from the get-go. This speaks again to what we were talking about at the front end of this video, which is to say Nintendo has had these kind of cracks, these seams in their leadership and strategy that you can see with things like the CES leaks. But it wasn't until the Direct that it really kind of crystallized for me that there seems to be a lot of behind-the-scenes lack of direction, lack of commitment to various things. And part of the Nintendo story is undoubtedly these tariffs that we're going to talk about. But the fact that they had a pre-order date that they had agreed to schedule coming off the direct and then rescinded it immediately, when what we're going to talk about with the tariffs is that volatility from the tariffs, that potential ambiguity, the things that they have to deal with, is not going to change between now and when they are actually launching the system in June. The specifics might change, and that's going to be part of our conversation. But the lack of certainty around what exactly it's going to look like when you try to move a Switch 2 unit from a warehouse to a consumer's hands in June of 2025, that's not going away. So there's just really odd choices at Nintendo for what they're committing to and what they aren't. And I, as a big Nintendo fan, would see them have stronger leadership.
And so this is the funny thing, right? Like, my channel has been putting out leaks about the Switch 2 for like, I think 2 years or more now. And this was over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, where a lot of that came from Nvidia, because that's who was designing the chip for it. And I think I had like basically full specs out, like half a year went by, a year went by, and I said, wait, where is this? Like, what is going on? Why do we know full specs? Like the PlayStation 5 Pro leak that went out, I believe we knew the full specs like half a year before it launched, not 2 years. And the Nvidia person told me, I don't know, we thought this was going to launch early 23 or 24 or something. We have no idea why this hasn't launched yet. And I want to take that point and just go, I've also heard and I think the other rumors came out that at a minimum in January, they had shipped a ton of these consoles into the US, hundreds of thousands at a minimum. So Nintendo's, I'm going to make that mistake a lot. Nintendo has had this thing done for a while. They've had stock in the US for a while, and yet they are surprised by the tariffs that were announced the week they said they scheduled to reveal the Switch 2. I don't know who's in charge there. Like, you're like, wait, tariffs disrupted something? It's like, dude, you scheduled the Switch 2 announcement when Trump said he was going to announce tariffs, and you're surprised he announced tariffs that could affect you. Like, I don't understand like how this could be done for so long and not finished, and how you could still be surprised that the week everyone was waiting to hear about tariffs had tariffs be announced that affected you. It just seems like a complete, yet lack of leadership and foresight to an almost like cartoonish degree.
Yeah, and I wish it weren't the case, and I wish I weren't saying it. It's not any pleasure of mine to say they have a lack of strength in leadership that gives me pause going forward with that company, because I would love to buy the Switch 2 and Mario Kart World and maybe even Donkey Kong Bonanza and say, I am all in for this system. I'm looking forward to what they have in the future. But I'm not as convinced that they have their finger on the pulse and a strong hand on the wheel.
And do you think they're a bit cocky too? Because the price of the console, I think I said publicly, I thought it'd be between $350 and $500. I was kind of hoping for $400, but $450 ultimately doesn't surprise me, especially not in 2025. But the game price rises, the key card thing, they still don't have achievements or trophies, which I know doesn't sound like a big deal to some people maybe, but that is sometimes the tiebreaker that gets someone to buy your game. And like, when are you going to start doing that? Never? It's so late. Like, it just still seems like they're just fumbling through and nickel and diming. And a lot of people nickel and dime. Certainly, I could point out some things Sony does. They just announced a new Last of Us collection again. I'm actually laughing saying it out loud, how many times they've repackaged that game.
It's certainly not The Last of Us.
No, and I'm sure there will be some other one. There's going to be some other one, but for PS6 or something. But I just think it's both a level of cockiness that seems silly, but also stupid, because I think there's a very likely chance we're in a recession this holiday season, and they're going to charge. I can't see a mom going to Best Buy and saying, oh, Mario Kart's now $80. And it certainly looks like, again, like, were it to be GTA 6, Fallout 5, I could see getting away with $80, $90 for a game. But I don't see a mom or a dad looking at Mario Kart and going, that looks next gen. And the comparison I made to all of this nickel and dime is, it's like, I think people forget the PS3 launched actually at the peak of the market. It'd be like if Sony announced a $600 console with $70 games in 2008 or 9. And I just feel like that's what Nintendo just did. And they didn't have to. This console was done for years.
Yeah, and they've got a good foundation with how many people love the Switch. It's the most popular gaming console of all time, or it will be soon. I think it's trending that way in front of the PlayStation 2. And so they have the launching pad that they need. And that's really what disappoints me in my corporate lawyer hat the most, which is to say this is the launch that should be the smoothest and easiest for a company to undertake. And yes, I actually was online talking about arrogance as part of this equation because they clearly think that they don't have any worries on these price points or what they're offering to the market. I think all of the video game companies are underestimating the volatility of the economy and what people are going to be willing to spend on what is ultimately a leisure pursuit and a high-end one at that. And I love gaming. This is really the first time in a number of years. I know people have rung the alarm bells on this for a while, but this is really the first time in a number of years where I have looked at it and thought, these guys actually could crash this thing if they are not careful. Like, I love video games. They're too invested in AAA. They're making things that are less popular than they otherwise were in just the same position in the last generation. Now you've got Sony saying that they're going to increase prices in various regions across the world. You've got Nintendo coming in with a high ball. And I agree with you. You've lost the, I'm going to say, impulse here. It's not really an impulse purchase when you buy a video game console, but it is kind of a friction-free or low-friction purchase for the moms and dads of the world if they do show up and say, I'm going to get something for $300.
If anyone could benefit from a impulse buying like mentality, I would think it's Nintendo, where a large proportion are parents buying for their kids. They see a game on sale with Donkey Kong, impulse buy, happy birthday, right?
Yeah, here's some Donkey Kong. He's got a banana on it. I'm sure you're going to have fun, son. Whatever it is. And I do think that you do lose that on the margins when it's 500, 550, whatever it winds up being at the end of the day. And yeah, Nintendo's got to be worried about that. But they haven't shown that they're worried about that right now. And we'll see how it goes. Gaming is in an interesting spot. They've never been in this spot before. Their companies make a lot of money, but every gamer is now also playing games that are 5 or 6 years old because these forever games, the free-to-play battle royales, the shooters, whatever it might be, are directly competing with whatever the new hotness is that fall or holiday season. So the entire gaming industry is reconfiguring. I find that fascinating and interesting from the perspective of someone that watches businesses.
Yeah, for people like us, it's going to create a lot of content we can make.
Yeah, I as a consumer of said things, I understand people's apprehension/terror on this stuff. I will only also add that the kind of triumvirate, tripolar video game universe is not something that has always been.
Yes.
It's not the only state that video games have ever found themselves in. I think that the PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo trinity has had such a long run that a lot of people can't even envision what it was like before that. And so I do think we're going to see a reconfiguration of some type. I don't know what Microsoft's long-term investment is. I think they're invested in making games and making software. I don't know what they're going to do with hardware. I'm not sure they do at this moment in time. But tariffs and governments across the world talking about video games more than they used to, we saw this with Microsoft and ABK, is something that gaming companies are going to have to deal with more than they did in the past. So Nintendo has found itself on the cutting edge, which is a rarity for Nintendo, of this particular conversation. And they're going to be helping figure out what to do with respect to tariffs and moving manufacturing around and doing other things when dealing with this particular administration and potentially the administrations in the future, depending on how this law is used and these kinds of executive orders are used for software and other manufacturing of goods.
Jessie is excited that it's finally spring. She's excited to run around and jump in the yard. And you know what? I think this sponsor here will also make you jump for joy, and that is CDkeyoffer.com. CDkeyoffer.com is a long-term sponsor of Moore's Law Z that provides something I think the PC gaming community just needs, and that's reasonable pricing on Microsoft software. But they have other things too. They have games and other products that you can check out. And the reason we've worked with them so long is they are good to us, and they've been good to the community for pretty much the entire life of Moore's Law is dead. And so I recommend you support someone that supports this channel. And you know what? If you want to, make sure you use offer code BROKENSILICON to save 25% on all Microsoft software and Die Shrink to save 3% on everything else on the website. Again, using those offer codes helps the channel, and it also helps you save money on something that is already much more fairly priced than you can get elsewhere. Again, support Moore's Law is dead at CDkeyoffer.com today. Yeah, I think there's a very real chance that I think this is something I've been saying for a while as I watch the slow and yet faster than I expected implosion of Xbox. Is like, there is nothing, like you say, that ordains there has to be these competitors. Actually, this is something I've been saying too with Intel and AMD as Intel implodes. It's like, I have no doubt that if Intel continues to fall apart, someone will still make CPUs. Someone will still make consoles. From the CPU side, you can see ARM, Qualcomm, and Apple kind of eating up into the pie. So I think we all know who would replace Intel already. But on the console side, I think it'd just become more multipolar. I think you'd have PlayStation really dominating home console harder than ever. But then you'd also probably have the pie left by Xbox just be eaten up on the margins. Like maybe Apple expands how well their little mini console like things game. Maybe Steam makes more and more Steam Deck and Steam console things. That eats a little bit into the people that were already kind of PC gamers that played console. And I think you just see everyone kind of eat up a portion of the pie and not replace Xbox right away. Maybe someone will. So far, what we've seen from like, was it Luma, whatever app Amazon did, that didn't exactly turn out, neither did Google. So I'm kind of skeptical someone will just easily get into game consoles, because it's like getting into the automotive industry at 20 years ago seems almost impossible right now.
You need a big commitment and a big uptake internally. I think one of the reasons that the big tech companies have dipped their toes in and then bounced out is that it does take that commitment. It's an unusual kind of market to learn and then to be successful in. And so you really need that kind of all in that Sony had in the 90s or that Microsoft had in the early 2000s. And I agree with you. I have no doubt that where there's a market, there will be producers. Somebody will be pushing on that door. But I have significant doubts that it will actually wind up being big tech itself. I think it would probably come from an unusual space that maybe isn't in the business of making anything digital right this second. But I agree that it will be covered. I suspect Microsoft will cover hardware for at least another generation or so. But I don't know where they go long term.
Yeah, and I guess that's something like, because I think you see, I would even go as far as to say like a false sense of despair when a company kind of becomes weakened or melts away, especially, and I say this as someone who's watched companies rise and fall on my channel now for a bit now. Like this is going to keep happening. Go back 100 years. Everyone was talking about what, the Rockefellers or something. Like times change, people. The thing to like be maybe sad about is like the smaller details, like that game that you like that isn't going to have a sequel now, or this one thing. But don't, because I see people like rooting for Intel a lot, or certainly Microsoft sometimes, like, well, they can't fail because if they fail, there will be no competition. Wrong. There will be competition. They will be replaced by something. And if they fail, I mean, they failed because they made mistakes. We should want there to be a better competitor. We wouldn't have a $700, arguably $800 PS5 Pro if Xbox was competing in a way that really pulled away from Sony's sales.
Yeah, and I think people understand that part intuitively. We want competition that helps keep the competitors in line, making better things for more effective cost margins and get us better stuff in our homes. I think people understand that. Where I think people do falter, and not just people, but like regulators. And this is one of the things I was talking about with respect to Microsoft and various things that the Federal Trade Commission here in the US were doing with respect to antitrust enforcement, is they lack this notion of dynamism in these specific marketplaces, that they look at everything as static. And if Microsoft goes away or if Activision goes away, then everything is ruined, even though there is a void there. And video game production, software creation is one of those areas where we have seen massive success stories from what amounts to exiles from bigger companies, that Respawn exists because Activision wasn't paying the people that made Call of Duty enough, or that they didn't think they were being paid enough. And that goes all the way back to Activision's creation. Electronic Arts and Activision exist because in that situation, these developers wanted to create their own thing. And so we can look at software creation overall, whether it's entertainment or serious software, and see that dynamism. And yes, we should want competition, but as you suggest, we don't just want competition as parties there saying, I'm competing. We want actual effective competition where people are putting their resources to making sure that quality goes up and price goes down. So yes, I agree with you. I believe in that dynamism. It's difficult for people, including regulators, to see because it essentially requires an article of faith that things will work out in the future, that there will be a moment in time where maybe someone does look like they have monopoly power. If they exert that, there's going to be a pricing difference that can be taken up by a new competitor. But it's hard to see that because we can't point to who that's going to be. We can't point to what that market looks like after it happens. We can only point to the harm in the short term. But I do try to remind folks of that. And when the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice or the CMA or whoever's looking at these things is doing their job properly, they are analyzing the dynamism of a given market at the same time.
And by the way, just on the subject of, and this is just something that comes to mind, like I, on a whim the other day, bought Stellar Blade, first AAA game out of a studio that usually doesn't make them. It's good. It's better than a lot of AAA games I've played from studios that supposedly have the pedigree to be making great AAA games for years. And it's like, well, see, look, like just because we don't know what the future will be doesn't mean that the future won't have the thing we assume it will have. It just might be under a different name. And like, yeah, don't let it turn into like competition welfare, like welfare for keeping the same competition.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I say a lot with antitrust is it's about protecting competition. It's not about protecting competitors. And it's easy for some of these regulators to kind of mess up where that line is. But yeah, the thing I'm most excited about in gaming is a game called Expedition 33, which is the debut game of a French studio that has no business making a game that looks as good as this one does. But I'm super excited about it, and I love to see new voices and new faces make things that I'm super excited about. So gaming, fortunately, is one of those areas where you get to see that a lot. And I'm excited about that game.
All right. Speaking of trying to protect competition, I think it's time to move on to the tariff discussion full-throatedly here. So, I mean, when I was putting this script together, when me and Carbon Cry were, who contributes, I'm not even sure we knew where to start. I mean, I woke up today and was like, I'm going to have to check what's happened. I mean, I literally have something Gerard can put on screen for today of like, I believe, let me pull it up actually so I make sure I know which one I'm quoting here. Like, stock markets rise on Trump tariff rollback. Same day, Trump threatens new tariffs on smartphones days after exempting them. So I think it should be noted that we're recording early Monday afternoon, April 14th. I mean, I just gave you two examples of how things whipsawed in the same day today before we started recording. Who knows what will be announced, the 15th when this comes out or the 16th. I could totally see Trump continuing to blink, but that doesn't take away from the fact that, like, I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Even if Trump were to completely roll back all tariffs, there are still major repercussions of everything that just happened anyway. So this is still going to be worth talking about. But I have to ask, honestly, just like to do me a solid, what is your understanding of what the tariffs are today?
Yeah, so I want to give the disclaimer here, which is to say there are specialty fields that are predicated on helping transactions take place across international borders. That is not my specialty as a lawyer, but I do have experience, if not specialty, in working through contracts and transactions that take place over borders. My specialty working in Southeast Michigan is probably to no surprise working Canada-US deals across those borders. But with that said, the current state of the tariff laws is charitably confusing. So one of the things that you are seeing, if you see reporting on these various aspects of the law, is that nobody quite describes them the same way. And that's a function of how this all went down. So ostensibly, in the Constitution, the ability to put tariffs on goods, and for those that don't know what a tariff is essentially a charge against the importer of a good from a specific location at a specific rate. And so you'll see various arguments about who's actually paying that because the importer pays it and where those prices wind up rolling to. I will tell you that the consumer, the end user of a good in economics, is the most likely to experience a pricing change from any level of taxation, which tariffs are, in this case, on the service of importing goods. And so you'll see some people say, well, it's on the importer, or they might say on the exporter, which it really isn't, but the exporter can take on additional losses or reduction in profits from the whole process. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds as to how this works, but I want people to be clear that it's a price imposed on importers, and then through the chain of production, somebody is going to decide on what the price is paid by consumers. And in general, it's going to make sense for the tariff price to be split amongst the various parties in a way where consumers are going to wind up paying some amount more to account for those tariffs. And so Nintendo here finds itself announcing a new product that is coming from Asia. And there are different reports on that are whether it's coming from China, coming from Vietnam. It appears that most of the Switch 2 components came from Vietnam, but we don't have full transparency on that. You might have more than me, honestly. And so what President Trump has done here is taken a specific law that allows for the president to declare emergencies in an economic vein and say, I'm going to impose these tariffs that Congress would ordinarily impose because there's this emergency. And the way that it was done by this administration is, I'm going to be charitable here, a little vague, right? Mm-hmm. So they have a bit of language in the main executive order that we're talking about here, and I'll see if I can pull up the number. I don't think it'll be useful to us because the numbers are usually pretty long, but I'm looking at the April 2nd executive order called Regulating Imports with a Reciprocal Tariff to Rectify Trade Practices that Contribute to Large and Persistent Annual United States Goods Trade Deficits, because that just rolls off the tongue. Mm-hmm. And in this particular order, they basically say we're going to place a 10% tariff on everything, but also we've got this list of things that our specific tariffs are not going to apply to. And in that list, we've included references to things like semiconductors, as well as lumber, articles, and pharmaceuticals. But that approach to putting tariffs out there in the world is a little bit loosey-goosey for the lawyer types among us, which is to say you don't usually put an umbrella term that says we're going to apply it to everything. We're also going to put a list here in what they call Annex 2 to the executive order, and it's not going to apply to those things, but then we're going to subdivide that list, and we're going to include broad scope categories like semiconductors, and then people are going to say, well, all right, you've covered semiconductors and components of semiconductors, but what about final goods that include semiconductors like laptops and cell phones and whatnot? So as of last Friday, which I think is April 11th? Mm-hmm. Am I 12th, 13th? Yeah. Of this year, they put out a helper guide that says, all right, we're also going to make sure that these don't apply to computers, laptops, cell phones, things that the Apples of the world were really worried about. But as you said in the news cycle today, there are certain concerns about whether or not that's an exemption or whether or not they're essentially just waiting to put tariffs under a different law, under a different bucket against people that make semiconductors. I also saw in the gaming side of things reporting that suggests that they covered computers, they covered cell phones, but they didn't cover gaming consoles. And people can read these in different ways. So you ask me, what's the overall landscape of tariffs? And my answer has to be, well, I can tell you what appears to be the intent. I can tell you what appears to be the vibes of what the tariffs are and what they intend to do with them. I can't sit here and say for you for certain that this is covered this way in Vietnam and this way in China, and semiconductors are included or not included in these various jurisdictions or treated in one way or the other, because these particular executive orders, this particular range of regulations and harmonizing tariffs and whatnot are confusing for everybody. And at the end of the day, the big story here is that confusion exists, not that there's a given rate for Vietnam or a given rate for China. It's that these companies, every company, not just Nintendo, but the Sonys of the world, everybody that makes anything over in any country that isn't the United States, have to try to figure out what the tariff impact is going to be towards their importers, because those importers are going to have to change the price that they're willing to pay for the hardware to begin with, and or the price that they're going to charge the end user consumer. And everybody's trying to figure this out. And because we don't know what it's going to look like tomorrow, Nintendo is sitting here saying, we're not quite sure when we open up pre-orders or what the price might be, because this is very confusing. And we don't want to wind up setting the wrong number, because as you know, there's a lot of stickiness to what that number is going to be. It's only a suggested retail price and all these other things that can change it in a given store that you find it in. But from Nintendo's perspective, we can't just say, oh, 450 is probably good enough. Maybe 475 is good enough. And then look at it and say, all right, tomorrow, actually, the tariff that our importers are going to have to pay is 50% higher than we thought it was. They are unwilling to pay the wholesale price that we want to charge them. And so now we're going to take a bath on that. And so you see this kind of trepidation, you see this kind of caution from these manufacturers. I'm very sympathetic to that, at least as it comes to the complexity of the question. The actual numbers here matter a little bit less than the fact that they're floating around on these hardware manufacturers all the time. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Quick Jumper writes in and says, what do you think is the most destructive element of the tariffs? I mean, you said it. It is the unpredictability, right?
Yeah, everything that requires capital to build, and that's factories, that's anything that's making things for you to use in your home, requires essentially a time horizon for the investment. You have to think about how this money is going to be used, how we're going to get it back. You see the business types, the MBAs talk about return on investment, talk about margins, that kind of thing. It becomes very difficult to predict any of that if we don't know what the entire cost structure of making and selling this thing in a given jurisdiction is.
And so I think that's like, again, like I've said this, some version of this spiel before, but like, were the Trump administration to announce 5% across the board tariffs with very specific 20% on auto or this thing, things that are very tangible, not murky, completed good, and it's this, and we know how to count it, and that gets 20%, everything else 5%, it'd actually be pretty simple because you wouldn't have to hire tons of people at borders to count things because there's nothing to count. Everything that's in at 5%, we're done. But the way this is done, too, isn't just like confusing. It costs more money to enforce, right? Because if every country has a different tariff and every product is a different percent, good Lord, is it even feasible that we could hire enough people at, ports to count how things should be tariffed?
Well, the exporters are going to have essentially reporting obligations. And so there's going to be certifications and frameworks, much like tax day, right? Tax day is tomorrow. And that's the taxpayer telling the IRS exactly what they owe. So there's going to be that element of this entire procedure. Where I see the bigger issue is that even if you had a 5% flat tax type tariff, even if you did something like that, we've never seen an administration, we've never seen a president use the Emergency Economics Act to do this in this way. So the concern, if you're a hardware manufacturer, is that it's 5% today, it's 45% tomorrow. Maybe it covers consoles tomorrow and not today. Maybe the opposite. We don't know. Semiconductors are listed as one of the exempt categories in the initial executive order, but not in a way that we could identify perfectly well. So there were clarifying executive orders. Will there be further clarifying executive orders? Do they mean to tariff semiconductors differently? We don't know a lot of things. And it's that unknown that really stifles the kind of capital expenses that we want to see in the production of goods. And so however you feel about the Trump administration or the usefulness of tariffs, the fright here from the corporation standpoint, the manufacturer's standpoint, is when Congress has the tariff power, we know Congress moves really slowly.
I was going to say, I was about to bring that up.
Much more slowly than some people would like. But you know that there's a stickiness there. It's going to take a lot of effort to move those numbers around. When a president says, I can do this with a pen and a phone, I can use IEPA, which is the nickname for this particular law based on its initials, to do this, then he can use IEPA to change it tomorrow. And that becomes a concern for the Nintendos of the world.
And that means that, like, and this is something I've been trying to explain to people too, like, the number one reaction to this is going to be to do nothing, right? Because if you're planning for making shoes or a laptop for this holiday season, all the planning is going on now. How many of this do I need to buy from Vietnam? How many of that do I need to source from, like, I know like Gibson Guitars gets like a certain sort of wood from parts of the west of the United States or something. Like, you're going to be tallying all of these things together. And then you're going to go, okay, and that will cost this much. This is what we charge this Christmas season. You don't know that. You don't know who to hire. You don't know anything. And so I think most likely what you're going to see, and we are seeing this, right? There's reports of Asus, MSI, and really large one, Lenovo, just stopping shipments of laptops to the US. I mean, I think that even were all tariffs to be removed tomorrow, the number one thing we're going to see, and this is the reaction I would make if I was a CEO, is we're not selling to America for the next 6 months because we don't know what to do, right?
Yeah, and if you have the ability, maybe throughout the entire administration. But even after Trump leaves office, this sits out there as a concern. And again, I'm a lawyer, so I look at this and say, honestly, I don't like emergency acts. I didn't love them during the pandemic. I don't love them in this context because I want the deliberative body, I want the legislature to go and figure these things out and generally be slow on economic issues like this, even if I agree with the thrust of what's happening here. And so I would sit here and advocate from a legal professional's perspective to say that that certainty is more important than any given policy on this stuff. And I would see Congress say, you know what? That Emergency Act maybe was not something that should have gone and given power to the executive in this context, and maybe we take that back. But I'm just one guy, and that's a policy prescription. But I do think that that certainty is important enough to look at and say that's a good idea. And unfortunately, regardless of how you feel about that, the way this has been implemented right now with the kind of umbrella terms and the annexes and the multiple different harmonized tariff schedules, and then going on and off, but only partially off, it makes it even more confusing. Even if you want to say, you know what, I'm in favor of this, I still want to invest in the United States, and so I'm going to do it in this manner. I don't even know what the costs are right this second because of the way that these things interact. And every major reporting outlet is telling me something different and I don't blame journalists for this because it's impossible. I looked at this just as research, as preparation for this video. I looked at these various nested executive orders and I said, I think if I had a full virtual legality that I was making, which would probably be on something like this, a couple of hours long, that I could parse through all of this and come up with specific answers to any given jurisdiction for any given good with essentially my full legal experience of 2 decades in reading things like this and put it together and maybe get you an answer. But when that answer can change tomorrow, nobody's even willing to pay the lawyers the legal fees to do that right this second. So it's very difficult for everybody. And I understand that passions are inflamed across various political polarities on this. I get that. This is really not about whether you like this as a policy or not. It's just the nature of the beast for making things to use in your home. And I'm very sympathetic, as you might expect from the corporate lawyer, to the corporations trying to deal with these things. And I hope it works out. But right this second, it does look like a bit of stickiness to our economy from the volatility here.
Yeah, and this is something I've been trying to explain to some people too, because I've seen a lot of people online say, well, no one can ignore the U.S. market. It's too big. And I'll remind them of a few things. If you combine the rest of the world, it's more than the U.S. So that's not true. You can make money in other countries, number one. Number two, I don't think anyone thinks everyone would stop selling to the U.S. forever, but I don't think it's unreasonable to think they would sell less of something, a lot less, cheaper versions of it if they have to, number two. And number three, a lot of these companies might just think it's out of their hands. I mean, again, if you say, well, you can't just not sell to the U.S., yeah, tell that to Dell, tell that to Lenovo, tell that to Nintendo. If these mega companies are pausing shipments to the U.S., everyone might, because it's not that they want to or that they think they'll make more money somewhere else, or they'll certainly try to. It's that they don't think they can do it here. And so they have no choice but to not sell to the U.S. And I think that's going to be, and I assume, number one, you agree with that, but also I do think that's just massive supply chain shocks going to happen this holiday season.
Yeah, I mean, I think across the board, the U.S. is such a big global economy that it's going to affect everything everywhere, in all honesty. I tend to agree that companies could potentially skip markets. It's certainly not going to be the top answer for companies. They're going to look for every way to not
long term. Yeah.
But it's a possibility. I think that it's more likely that you'll try, if you're a manufacturer, to figure out what is in the long term, if not the medium term, the tax haven equivalent jurisdiction to production, whether that's Vietnam or somewhere else for these various manufacturers, that you'll try to find a place where you're going to get more favorable treatment on the stuff that you're shipping to the United States and maybe move all of your production line there. Obviously, Nintendo moved, I believe, from China to Vietnam in the last Trump administration, in large part because of tariffs and tariff threats. And so this looks to be a furtherance of that kind of issue for people that are outside the Nintendo sphere. And I would expect to see more of that. The Trump policy statements in this executive order and elsewhere are stating that they want to see manufacturing in the United States proper. I don't know that that's the likely outcome.
This piece of content is brought to you by JLC PCB, a trusted partner for easy, affordable, and reliable PCBs and PCBA solutions. They have 19 years of expertise since 2006, and they help electronics engineers bring their projects to life efficiently. Why choose them? Well, because they have unbeatable prices. You can get 1 to 8 layer PCB starting at just $2. They have large-scale production and cost-effective manufacturing for unbeatable value, and this is in-house production with full control over every process, ensuring quality and stability and strict quality control. So get your PCBs produced in as little as 24 hours. And right now they have a special offer. You get 5 pieces of 100 by 100 millimeter 2-layer flex PCBs for only $2. And this supports Pi, FR4, and 3 MTake stiffeners. And so check out the link in the description to get access to this deal and support Moore's Law is Dead today. I was about to ask about that next because my suspicion would be a lot of them, I mean, some might, when they can, for some things that are easy to move to the U.S. quickly. But that's not most things. My suspicion would be most people would move outside the U.S. because they see it as unreliable.
Yeah, well, and it's a costly labor force here. There's no question. Being one of the richer countries on earth makes the labor force more expensive. And so a lot of companies that make things are going to try to not necessarily make them here. And that's kind of a butting of heads with the presidential administration, who clearly wants to have those manufacturing jobs here. That's at least the ostensible reason for all of this. And so we're all speculating here, of course, but looking at this from afar, I don't necessarily see this driving jobs to the United States, but it might wind up moving things around the world a little bit. And one of the things that I thought was an unfair attack on these tariffs that I did see in the social media sphere a lot is like the 10% tariff attaches to like the Penguin Island and things like that. And the reason that you go and put a specific tariff on every jurisdiction in the world is to try to get around what I was just describing, is to try to not incentivize moving your factories to the Penguin Island or anything else in that kind of vein, to avoid these things, to avoid creating tax havens. And so I'm at least sympathetic to an administration that says, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to blanket this. We're going to put a baseline out there so that we can avoid the incidents where a company that we would determine to be a bad actor if we were in the administration goes and deliberately makes manufacturing in a place that doesn't make sense from a logistics perspective because our tariffs are so low there, because it's a 0%, because nobody lived there when we were doing this executive order. And so I am sympathetic to that. I have a show on my channel called Hangouts and Headlines where we look at the way media reports on various things. And I do think that that was a little bit unfair. But understand, I'm also sitting here telling you that I think this framework of executive orders creating a tariff regime like this is not one that is workable over even the short term, because you wield this pen in a way that makes companies unable to make these long-term investment decisions. And when we talk about long-term investment decisions, it's not just where do I build a factory today? That takes a long time to process and then to figure out how those logistic chains work. So the reason you're seeing the stickiness, the reason you're seeing people stop and not necessarily figure out what it is that they're going to do is because you can't make a 10-year commitment on investment when you don't know what something's going to be in the next administration. That's what we've seen throughout the history of the United States, but especially if you don't know what somebody's going to do the next week. And so the on-off switch, the changes in the baseline, the various things that we've seen in terms of explaining these executive orders makes all of this more tenuous than it might otherwise have been. So I don't know that people have asked me is there a way for this to be fixed? Is there a way that you would write this differently? All these various things. The answer to that is really no. Once you get into this business of having a global trade war and changing these various things on the fly, you've already lost I'm going to say faith. It's not really faith, but the notion that these companies have that there is certain amounts of certainty that they have for what their cost structure is going to look like so that they can make those 10-year decisions now. And so I've talked about Nintendo not having a strong hand on the wheel. I still think that, but you would need like an iron grip on the wheel in order to navigate this stuff. So I am sympathetic to that.
Yeah, that was one of the final things I was going to say about this before moving on a little bit is like, I can't see any company going, oh, we just spent all of this money moving our factories to Vietnam. And because the Trump administration put on tariffs for 2 days before blinking, well, that means we're definitely moving to the US. What they're going to say is we definitely shouldn't move. We should move around the US as much as possible because we don't know what the rules will be in the US year to year. And we just need to look at ways and how we can mitigate how this affects us globally as we move forward, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether people will come to the United States. Obviously, the tariff power does not extend to the domestic production capabilities of the country, and that's at least something you can hang your hat on.
Although it takes 10 years to make some of these factories.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Is that, but you know that tariffs aren't necessarily your problem. You've got other volatility issues with respect to the United States or the administration or anything else. But tariffs in specific is not your issue, and so you might. If you're Donald Trump, if you're the administration, say, I can make the rest of the world as volatile as I want. And if I can frame the United States as essentially a port in the storm because I don't have the power to enforce these things on the homeland, if you will. I can imagine a scenario in which the administration is trying to create that particular situation. I don't know whether that's happening or not. I obviously cannot speak to what's happening in the four corners of the White House on these things. But the truth is nobody knows. And so that is its own kind of problem.
So, and this gets into something that I used to kind of I wouldn't say poo-poo, but like, let me back up. So a lot of times when graphics cards release, most of the initial supply goes to the United States. Moore's Law is dead is very global. I think like we're like a third Europe, a third Asia, a third America. Somehow we've gotten to that. And so a lot of our, I've heard, I know you're on Sacred Symbols a lot. I've heard Colin harp about this, having to explain how sales taxes work in the US to Europeans is always a never ending thing because they'll say, well, why does this graphics card here, in Sweden cost 10% more? And it's like, well, you have a 20% VAT. Also, they exchange it to the dollar and then add 7% to the US price. Usually it's within 3% the same price as what it would cost in the US. But even outside of that, usually most of the supply is in the PC space is shipped to the US first. Again, I try to explain, but it's one border that can just be shipped all over the country with people with a lot of money. Again, that makes sense why you would ship to the US maybe most of your supply first. And then usually like a few days after the launch, it arrives in Europe in high volume. But it's usually the more pricier models because, it's very different than consoles. Graphics cards, there's the suggested price, and that's, if you're lucky, half of the supply unless it doesn't sell well. And it's very much a suggestion. But I'm wondering if you think that can change. So Magnolius Radkusis writes in and says, how would the tariffs affect Europe? Will prices also increase? My short answer is, well, yeah, I expect prices to, generally speaking, go up short term for everyone because of the chaos. But I wonder what you think about this idea that, like, at least in terms of like a graphics card where like Taiwan makes the chip, there's a PCB made in China, packaged somewhere, maybe in Vietnam. And that's just one example. Companies have their supply chains all over that region. That doesn't touch the US, though, really, except that maybe it's Nvidia or AMD, but it's shipping from there. Like, could you see that changing where these companies maybe prioritize shipping a lot of their initial supply to Europe for the next couple of years before they ship to the US with the pricier models? Like, could that flip something like that?
I think anything that imposes some kind of cost structure on a component of the marketplace has the chance to create market distortions or to otherwise change how actors in the market operate. And in this particular case, again, we've got multiple markets. So we've got importers that are buying these goods in order to resell them. And if you've got a jurisdiction, maybe it's Europe, maybe it's somewhere else, that has importers that are willing to pay more because they don't have to pay as much in tariffs or any other reason, then yes, I would expect the manufacturers to start giving preference to those places that are willing to pay more. And so importers here in the United States might just be willing to pay less because somebody has to eat the tariff cost. than their competitors in Europe, and then they might start going to Europe. But depending on how much that happens and who has the leverage in that context, you might see those importers in the United States start to agree to pay more. There's a whole dynamic range of potential opportunities there, but this is where the market deformation comes in, is that we don't know exactly who's going to wind up eating that tariff cost. We know that some of it's going to be spread to customers. We know that some of it's going to be eaten by the importer, and some of it's going to be eaten by the exporter, the manufacturer. And so they're going to be inclined to try to get their goods to where they make the most money from them. That's the same as it ever was. It's just that we have to remember that the manufacturer itself is not usually the one that is selling direct to the consumer. Can happen, of course, and it certainly can happen with specialty goods. But when we're talking about importing, the importers and their leverage or lack thereof are going to be a part of that story.
Yeah. Okay, so Karino Sugata writes in and says, according to reports, TSMC is already producing chips for Apple and AMD in Arizona. And I believe this came out this morning. Nvidia announced they're going to build their big AI chips in the US. Now, for gamers, though, I couldn't find it in the article, at least quickly. To me, this sounds like those, like, I don't even know what they cost at this point, $100,000 AI, like, mega computers. This isn't the gaming chips, to my understanding. But still, I know I have to add on to this reader mail that I believe NVIDIA's also announced they're going to at least produce their hyper expensive stuff in the US soon as well. But it says, if the chips are shipped to an AIB or system builder, though, outside the US, right? Because again, I think everyone's, especially this administration, actually thinks TSMC makes the PS5. They don't. They make a fifth of the BOM cost at most, or something like that. And then that is shipped somewhere where there's packaging, and then there's people who make the case and the power supply company over here. But he says, if the chips are shipped to an add-in board partner or system builder outside the US, would an importer for the final product have to pay the full tariff on this regardless? How long do you expect the tariff war to be going on before a deal gets struck to the end as well? And if the tariff war doesn't end, how would the low-income individual, especially minimum wage and below, include those of us only having supplemental security income to live off of, survive this? I feel like that's very different questions. I mostly want to focus on how you would see the packaging and whether it's fully assembled and then imported, partially imported, like, versus AMD and Nvidia, especially, like, who's gonna, like, how would you play this in your opinion?
So the important part to understand about tariffs here is that because they're international law, there is a harmonized schedule of tariffs that all the countries of the world use to help explain exactly what they're imposing on what. And that is divided into such minute detail between end products and components that everything is treated separately, including at potentially separate rates for different countries, it's different things. So one of the issues that was in this particular set of executive orders is that they just said semiconductors aren't included, but they didn't really break that down as to what is built with semiconductors. And that's what the clarification was intended to be. And that's why there's so much reporting on the fact that consoles were not included in that clarification, but aren't otherwise on this list of things that's covered by this executive order, obviously itself. So there's a lot of confusion there, which is a long way of saying that even if you make the chip here, to the extent that somebody else is importing a final good, that's a different number on the harmonized tariff schedule. That's a different thing that you're looking at. You're still going to have to pay the tariff if you're in the business of importing that particular good, even if the component itself was made in the United States. So it gets really complicated. Supply chain management and logistics companies make their money on answering these types of questions and trying to figure out the lowest cost way to get something like this done. I am not the right person to ask on that particular question. Logistics is the bane of my existence, but there are definitely companies that specialize in that particular question. And when all the inputs in their software are moving around, that's when you get worse answers from them. That's one of the issues that these companies are having this moment.
So I'm curious, though, if you'll indulge me, though, like how you think, because I believe AMD's making some of their CPUs, including for gamers on PC, in Arizona now, I believe. And there's some suggestion their new graphics cards that are doing fairly well might be starting to be manufactured there too. I'm just wondering, like, how much of a difference you think it makes if, like, how you would suggest they'd probably handle, like, they're going to make the chips, let's say, for the RX 9070 XT in Arizona. And then would you think then they would set up an assembly facility to ship the heat sink, the PCB, all the fans that cool it, all that stuff into the US and assemble this here, right? Because once it leaves and comes back, it gets tariffed, right?
Well, those components get tariffed coming in. So
Sure, true.
the
That's
answer to
true.
this question is ridiculous complicated. And you're going to look to figure out exactly where you can have the most efficient production line. What jurisdiction is that in, right? Why is Nintendo making their Switch in Vietnam? Presumably because they found that was the most cost-effective place to make it and then move it around the globe. But I can't answer that question so well right now, not just because of the complexity we're talking about, because that's not what I'm good at. But these companies are going to have to answer those questions moving forward, and maybe it makes sense to bring everything into the United States first and then sell out of it. My guess is it doesn't. My guess is it makes sense to put everything else in some other tax haven,
right?
type
Because they
jurisdiction
don't
and then
just sell to the
into it.
US, right? And if there's reciprocal tariffs from European countries and China, even if you saved money on the US, then if you want to ship it to France, they are still going to have some tariff potentially. Again, it's very
Yeah.
confusing, but you're making me realize, like, I guess there might be the US assembly and then the assembly around Taiwan that goes to Europe and Asia and everywhere else, and then something special for
And the
the
rates
US.
can be different depending on what component you're talking about, what end product you're talking about. And so there's like PhDs in this kind of stuff of, okay, we're going to make this thing over here. And if we make this thing over here, we're going to have an extra assembly line that could potentially make this thing, but that's maybe not cost effective over here. We're going to build specific kinds of factories in this jurisdiction, but not this jurisdiction. And we're going to move it here, and we're even going to port it in various places because of these kinds of rules and regulations. So I can't answer that question with specificity, unfortunately, but it is the kind of complex question that these companies are having to deal with now and have dealt with to some extent. This is not a United States only deal for the entire lifespan of their manufacturing process, because companies around the world have tariffs. The United States is not alone there. This is kind of maybe the wildest imposition of tariffs we've seen in economic history, but countries have their own tariffs, and you have to be able to itemize your components and where you're building something and understand what your cost structure is in order to make these things. It's one of the reasons why I am always so impressed that we get anything at all, right? I mean, the fact that the Switch 2 exists, when you look at all the symbols on the back of the box or the back of the case of your favorite piece of hardware, a lot of that is certified as being compliant with various import and export regulations, having paid our tariffs, complied with the intellectual property laws or patent laws of wherever we're talking about. I mean, just look at the back of your phone someday, or look at the back of your Switch and see all those things. That looks like a lot of legal craziness, and it is, but that is the manufacturers figuring out how to comply with all the regulations that apply to them.
Yeah, and it's funny too, like, and again, I'm not necessarily even looking for like legal advice, but just pointing out another thing I'm realizing as we talk, like, okay, so there's a cutout for semiconductors. Is the fan on the graphics card a semiconductor? Maybe. The heatsink, well, this is a hunk of metal. Why should it be a semiconductor? So then if there's a cutout though, maybe you do still want to assemble this out of the United States if you can count the whole thing as a semiconductor. But if you can't, then actually, yes, ship them in before they're counted, assemble them here, and only the semiconductor part counts. Like,
yes, and that's why the clarifying executive order was issued. Is they said, okay, we're getting a lot of crap from the Apples and the laptop manufacturers of the world about what this means, and so we are going to say that this specific implication, this specific imposition of tariffs is not going to apply to a final laptop because we were maybe unclear about what semiconductors meant in this context, and then folks noted that they didn't include video game consoles in that additional explanation. I think the intent of the administration is to not hit some of this tech as hard as it initially seemed, whether that's from lobbying from tech companies or otherwise, is up to the eye of the beholder. But we don't really know because, as you said, the Trump administration has also gone out today and said, no, it's not an exemption. We're going to tariff it in a different way. It's like, okay, we don't know what that means as of right now. And so it gets really confusing really fast.
yeah, and so I'm just trying to like even find a way if I can even have any way of even semi answering my own question though that started this part of the discussion. And the short answer is we still don't really know, but like when I think about like AMD, I think compared to Nvidia do much better in the US. Like I think Nvidia, although they're picking up in Japan supposedly right now, but I think Nvidia I've heard is like 95% of the Chinese market compared to Radeon or AMD, and like 90% in Japan. And so if you're a company that's already getting a much more significant part of its sales outside the US, you're probably more likely to just go, I don't know. I mean, hopefully these laws change and we're just going to keep assembling everything outside the US and try to focus on selling to the outside markets. Whereas, and so that would mean that in the US, the prices of probably Nvidia is going to continue to go up for the short term, I would think. And then for AMD, in the short term, I know that they, same as Sony did with the PS5 Pro, I believe, by the way, when they knew tariffs were coming, they shipped just everything to the US first. That will help blunt it short term, but long term, it'll be interesting to see if they can really afford to focus on a market that's more important to them. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's my best I can come up with.
And again, it's vibes, right? What I'm talking about here is you're in these companies, you know that they can change any moment, but you can't just stop doing whatever it is that you're doing. And so you're looking at what is the intent here? What are the likely messages that I'm supposed to get? And yes, one is they'd like us to manufacture in the United States. If we can make that at all costs make sense for us, maybe we look at ways to do that, but we don't want to invest in multi-year projects because we don't know what tomorrow will hold. We also know that the one thing that survived and indeed increased as part of this flurry of executive orders is the tariff on China. So the one message that the United States is sending with clarity is get your manufacturing the heck out of China. However you feel about that, whether that's fair or not, that is what the United States is saying to the world, is that the one thing that survived is we're going to hit Chinese goods as hard as possible. So if we can move to Vietnam, great. If we can move somewhere else that makes sense, great. That's if I'm CEO, I'm sitting there saying, I don't want this job. This is terrible. I can't figure all this out. Sure. But I'm also saying, all right, we don't want manufacturing in China if we're trying to sell into the United States. And we have to start looking at low tariff jurisdictions, which may or may not be Vietnam at the end of the day. We got a 90-day pause. Do they come back in 90 days? Do they come back different in 90 days? Nobody knows.
Kiln God writes, and it says, hey, Tom and Richard, I lived in Australia back in the 1970s when I was in middle school. At the time, tariffs were high and watches to cassette players were double the price of what they cost in the US. And there's a huge gray market for a lot of imports, which I believe is going to happen here. A lot of external exporters may decide to stop exporting and work with an importing wholesaler, which adds another 15% for the middleman. Like when Land Rover says goodbye, a wholesaler then steps in. So I assume the minimal price increase is going to be double that of tariffs. What do you believe the price overage will be above the tariff rates? And I think that's something I've said too to people is like the chaos in shipping, the slowdown in ports, like the increase itself, were it just a flat 10%, the prices for most things would probably go up more than, because I think there's going to be a lot of people that, let's give a hypothetical example. I don't know what the final rate's going to be at whatever, or if there will be one. Maybe there will be no rates in a week. But if the Nintendo Switch allegedly has a 10% rate, you would agree that it's probably going to go up in price more than 10%, if anything, just for risk, right?
Right, but there's other things that go into the economics there, which is to say there are kind of sticking points for consumers. When we talk about the $399s and the $499s, they exist because those are standardized pricing across consumer electronics. My current bet, and this is just a bet, this is just speculation, is that Switch 2 pre-order announcement comes with a $499 price. Because we don't know exactly what the final tariff is going to be in Vietnam. We don't know if Nintendo is already moving manufacturing around. We know that they're shipping units and trying to get around various things that way. But if I'm Nintendo, one of the things I'm trying to do is hedge against volatility. And so I'm going to set a price that's high enough where I wouldn't have to change it if they come in at a different rate than I expected. And I think 500 probably does that for me. I can't make a guarantee there. But that's what I would expect, because you start going into the 50s and people start kind of automatically rounding up. The 99 has a value to consumers to say $499. And they had already half announced $449. So it's already going to feel like something of an increase, a hike. Nintendo's already got some bad press. But with the tariffs as they stand right now, I look at the Switch 2 launch as an area where Nintendo, if they're smart, can say, this is all on your president. Blame your president on all this. It was going to be $449. He made it $499. And I think they're going to be able to get away with that if they choose to go that route, which means that I think they will go that route. But overall, you're right. The forces of economics here are that this volatility, this slowdown, this what I keep describing as stickiness, is going to reduce supply. And if you're familiar with your supply and demand curves, that means the price is going to go up. Supply is going to go down. People are going to be willing to pay more for less supply available on the marketplace. And that's likely to have an effect in addition to the fact that the price is going to go up to accommodate the fact that somebody is eating a loss. And it's probably going to be you, the consumer, because the importer and exporter don't have a lot of strong economic pressures to not pass it on to you. So yes, it's probably, if we take a 10% baseline as just what is happening in the future, it's probably 10% plus some juice, plus some vig, whatever that is, because of the slowdown and the volatility and people trying to figure out how to get you products in the first place.
Yeah, and it's funny you mention like the Switch 2 that it might still be $499 for other factors due to other factors, but I would agree, especially because my suspicion is they would have considered $399, but $449 was already them adding a little extra for risk. And then what the Trump administration announced was just substantially more than they thought it would be. I mean, everyone says that this was more than they expected, and that's where they delayed it again. And so there's probably already some fat in there where they might be able to get away with another 10%.
Yeah, and I think you do have those stopping points, just because when you're talking about consumer-facing goods, that's just the way that the market looks at these things, right? There's a reason that markets kind of become what they are. There's a reason mobile games have real difficulty going over 99 cents, and that's just because of consumer expectations. And this is a consumer electronics where Nintendo has never really been in this space before, period. And so I have trouble saying they're going to go over the 500 number. It's not impossible. Like I said, I don't have a strong belief in their business leadership right now, so they could do whatever they feel like. But $499 is my best bet right this second, which of course is a little bit less, or maybe a little bit more. Don't ask your lawyers for math, kids. Than a 10% increase on the existing price as it was announced after the direct.
Yeah, I agree with you psychologically, especially because I bet PlayStation can more easily get away with keeping the PS5 with disk drive at $499 simply because ultimately they're making money off of the software, and were Nintendo to go to 600 again, just psychologically, that would look really odd for that to cost that much more than a PlayStation, especially when they've probably stockpiled a lot of PlayStations in the US already and aren't going to have to raise the price on that for a while here. I just think that whether it's fair or not,
fair. We're not talking fairness here. We're talking about what the market will bear, essentially. What can I sell my product at? And no, none of this is going to feel fair. There was an earlier question that had how can people on subsistence living amounts survive this? This is going to be rough on everybody. And like everything that's rough on everybody, it's going to be rough the worst on the worst off among us. That is going to be the case. I don't want to be the deliverer of that news. Slowdowns in the economy. We've unfortunately been through a few now. They suck for everyone. But if you don't have anything to start out with, they suck worse for you.
Yeah. This piece of content is brought to you by the fans that support the independent journalism of Moore's Law is Dead on Patreon. And it does need supporting, from personal attacks from tech elites that get mad when we tell you that they are lying to gamers and their own shareholders, to legal attacks from mega corporations that cost the team time and money. This is expensive and often very stressful work. And it's work that doesn't depend on access journalism, nor depend on NDAs or agreements that would sanitize our opinions and hold us back. No, nothing holds us back, and we are independently funded, and we use said funding to do things like pay professional renderers to show you products before they come out so that the sources that provided us the original pictures don't get in trouble. Or we also create bonus content like Die Shrinks, where you have videos and interviews coming out multiple times a month exclusively to reward our patrons with the extra content that we know they would like to see, whether it's inside scoops or more in-depth conversation and stuff that we just know wouldn't profit if we put it out publicly, but it doesn't need to profit for our fans on Patreon because it is self-funded. And so if you want any of that bonus content, or you want to support the independent journalism of Moore's Law is Dead, or honestly, if you just want to support me, Dan, Gerard, Carbon Cry, or Jesse and Maurice so that we have food on the table every day, consider supporting Moore's Law is Dead on Patreon. And to those that already support us there, I'll see you on the Discord. Magnolis Rakusis writes in again and says, assuming that the console prices will go up due to tariffs, yeah, well, we'll see. We will see a course correction in games prices could remain stable or go down. Or will game or console gaming become a luxury hobby again? I think it could. Short term, there's stockpiles, no. But I think, yeah, I think if this trade war were to go really badly in a year from now, I think for sure this would be one of the things, especially the lower half of income earners would cut prices on big time.
It's hard to say, right? It's a luxury good. There's no question. Those tend to be things that have trouble in economic recessions or other economic downtimes. But it's an entertainment luxury good, which
Sure.
often sees a bounce when we talk about things like the Depression. Movies did all right because people were looking for that escapism. And so there's competing forces on video games and video game prices. As I said earlier in this video, though, I don't have a ton of faith in Sony increasing the price and Nintendo going out and saying we don't have a pre-order date or price for you right now. And so this is the kind of thing where if you have enough actors in the marketplace make a mistake at the same time, you could have real problems. And if you have those real problems, then supply goes down, prices go up, everybody's unhappy, and we have something like a crash. Not ETs in a landfill, not Atari in the 80s, but something that looks very different than what we were seeing in gaming as early as 5 years ago.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've already seen quite a few large games. Like I'd probably include Starfield in this. Of course, what's the biggest one? The most comical one's probably Concord from Sony. These games that had immense budgets that just was pouring money into a fire pit, basically. And you can only get away with that when money is cheap, but money might not be cheap soon. And I think, yeah, you could see a lot of studios. And again, you look at a game like Elden Ring, where they paid half as much to make that, or I think, or something as like an Assassin's Creed, yet it sells better and seems to have more what I would call real content. Like, and then you see, again, I brought up Stellar Blade, budget probably I'm sure a third of what the latest Assassin's Creed is. Although the latest Assassin's Creed looks good. I don't want to say it's bad.
I like Shadows.
Yeah. So
yeah, my example here would be Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, right? It's
sure.
made,
Everyone brings that one up. Yeah.
It's made in Europe. I think the budget that we've been told, you never know exactly how true all these things are, but the budget we were told was $40 million.
Wow.
It's content rich. It's a huge game. And you start to have these same conversations about manufacture in the United States as you do about software development in the United States, which is to say, in other jurisdictions, if the labor force isn't as expensive, maybe these companies start to look at that as part of this particular story. Now, we don't have digital tariffs discussed as part of all of this right now,
not yet.
but it's not impossible. Yeah, that's what I was going to add is we don't know exactly what the future holds. We've talked about that with respect to semiconductors. Software seems safe right this second. You don't have the United States trying to get software making jobs back. But if that were to become a thing, especially under the current administration, you couldn't say that that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so you have that whole conversation as well. But I do think that game companies are going to look for ways to not spend $100, $200, $300 million making their game. And one of the ways they can see success cases is in labor forces that are in Poland or Czechoslovakia or other places that maybe have a less expensive labor force.
Mm-hmm. Dreddy Bear writes in and says, regarding tariffs, I'm curious on both of your thoughts on the risk of lawfare against U.S. companies within China, which of course include Tesla, Apple, and Intel, and what that would entail for our companies going forward, given whatever situation you think that would come to pass.
Well, China's pissed. There's no question about that. We're seeing that in real time. Lawfare is an interesting concept in China. I have had limited but existent experiences with intellectual property protection in China and the issues with the Chinese courts enforcing that intellectual property protection across contracts with various United States companies. And so I think to the extent that China gets pissed enough to essentially not enforce intellectual property or other contracts originating from U.S. companies, you might have a real economic issue. But I can't speak to the Trump administration. I certainly can't speak to the Chinese administration. And so, yes, is there a real chance of a full-on economic war here? Yes, there is, because China is angry about this stuff. And I would keep my eye on that. But I don't know how that's going to go. I don't think President Trump knows how that's going to go. I'm not sure China knows how that's going to go. So, yes, volatility. Unknowns. The economy hates unknowns. And that's where we're living right now.
Well, it's funny, too, because a second ago spoke like directionally of what you would do. And you said, well, one thing that seems clear and is somewhat of at least a through line across American administrations is less with China. And it's
Yes.
like, okay, but then you combine that with the fact that the one they actually forgot how high it was. It's not 125, it's 145%, I believe.
Yeah, it's hard because they've got multiple different tariff like buckets. So yeah, I think it's up at 145 right now.
So the 145% tariff on China is effectively a trade embargo. I mean, you can't, almost nothing has 100% profit margins. I mean, that just means you can't do trade unless there's a cutout. And so if you're China and you're like, well, they've basically done a trade embargo on us, say what you will, but previous administrations seemingly keep getting harder and harder on us. Anytime, like when Trump lost to Biden, and but Biden kept a lot of the tariffs on China. So if you're China, you're like, directionally, it seems like the US is pushing everyone away from us. And it seems consistent for the past 10 years. Why wouldn't we just throw out the rules and say, yeah, I mean, look, it seems like you never want to do business with us again. We can read the writing on the wall. Now you're doing a trade embargo. We should just push out every US company from our country because you're kind of telling us you're going to do that to us anyways. So, like, what do we have to lose by doing this?
Well, I would argue that what you have to lose is the faith of potential future American partners. Like the situation right now
Sure.
is that an American company that wants to manufacture in China is going to have certain trade secrets and certain intellectual property information that is in those manufacturing locations in China. And China had a very bad reputation for a very long time of essentially just grabbing those, giving them to Chinese companies and doing their own competition with stolen intellectual property. And they somewhat got away from that reputation over the course of a couple decades, and more American companies were willing to work with them on various things. Some got burned, many didn't. And that's part of the Chinese-American relationship story. But if China gets so pissed about this, they just say, yeah, we're tearing up all of the contracts. Everybody's intellectual property is free reign. Then when things calm down, whenever that may be, God let it be tomorrow. But whenever things calm down, you're an American potential partner. You say, well, the last time you just wound up looting everybody's locations. I'm not so inclined to work with you. And so every administration, whatever country you're talking about, has to look to some future horizon and say, how are my actions today going to be perceived by future partners if I need them tomorrow? So maybe China says we're getting out of the American partnership manufacturing business, and that's okay. But they have a lot of mouths to feed in China as well. So I think that that's not as clear of attack for them to take as it might otherwise appear. But again, I'm speculating, and I'm not a foreign policy advisor. And so take that with whatever grain of salt you want to apply.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you said, could they eventually? It's like, if this really were to go worst case scenario, you could see that. But even with how bad things seem now, were you to do that, were the CCP to do that in China, it would basically be, well, you're doubling down that this is done forever. And do you really want to double down on every U.S. company? Because, I mean, war game it out. Does that future look good? I mean,
yeah. No, that's a nuclear bomb of economic warfare. It is. So I wouldn't expect them to do that, but I mean, they've been demonstrably upset about this chain of events and have been putting out information across media outlets about how upset they are. And so, yeah, it's possible. Administrations, politics, governments are just people. Everything we do on Earth,
I think it's
just
easy for people to forget that.
Corporations, administrations, people. And even if we game out, this may not be rational because this winds up in the equivalent of nuclear winter for economics. It might be the case that people get emotional enough that they say, well, one, we don't believe it'll go that direction, or we can rationalize that it won't go that direction, and I need to impose some pain right now. You could argue that that's what the U.S. is doing to China. And so if China does that, yeah, I think that would be bad news for basically everybody, but it is a possibility. This is the kind of game you play when you engage in this kind of high-level brinksmanship, whether it's with economics or forces in the world. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I know China is pissed, or at least projecting as such, and I don't think there's any reason to believe that they're not.
I think it wouldn't be surprising if we were in their shoes to be pissed at a minimum. AI Soldier 789 writes, and it says, good day to you too. Reuters and other news outlets have stated that Intel's new CEO is linked to many Chinese investment companies. And Intel states that Lip Bhutan stated the potential conflict of interest before becoming CEO. Could these facts complicate cooperation between TSMC and Intel?
Well, I looked at this story for the first time when you sent me over the link to it, and I hadn't been following this. But the first thing that jumped out to me is that just having an investment interest in another body, even if it's in a different country, doesn't automatically make it an actionable conflict of interest, right? When we talk about conflicts of interest at a corporate level, we're talking essentially about being on both sides of the table for one reason or another. So if Intel were to try to enter into a contract with one of the companies that this gentleman otherwise has an interest in, that's when you start talking about, okay, somebody's going to have to step out of the room to make these decisions. Someone's going to have to get an advisory board or otherwise have the shareholders bless these decisions in order to avoid conflicts of interest. But overall, it's not obvious to me, just from what the reports say, that this is a kind of legally actionable issue as much as it's one where the shareholders have to understand the potential risks at the company. And if they can accept them, then generally speaking, from a corporate law perspective, that's going to be okay with us. Does it complicate other things? It could. But the shareholders, as long as they bless the hiring and say, yes, we understand what the conflicts are, then the law is mostly okay with that as a framework. And there are parts of that report that suggest that certain investors were happy with this individual's experience with these other companies in other jurisdictions. And so you have competing concerns. It's why shareholders get the final say on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I guess then, and tell me if you think this is a silly thing to mention as an issue. I guess the number one thing I'd just be worried about is if Trump gets along with him, right? Like if he sees a new Asian CEO of Intel with an investment history in China and finds a reason to be mad about that, that'd be probably my biggest concern then. Or I don't know if you think that's silly.
No, I mean, I think that's something that you have to be considering when you're in the board of directors room deciding on your CEO, when you're the shareholders that may be asked to bless the hiring of the CEO, is what is this person's relationship going to be with the given governing body of wherever we're talking about, the Trump administration here, other administrations in other jurisdictions. You're always concerned, if you're a big multinational corporation with millions, if not billions of dollars on the line, that administrations, governments of all stripes can really harm you. So they better not have a personal grudge with your CEO. And some administrations, you're less worried about that than others. And maybe this is one where it does seem like the administration might well have personal issues with various things that you have otherwise hired into your C-suite. I don't think that's silly to be concerned about, but I don't think, if I'm an investor, if I've got a lot of money in a company, that I look at that and say it's a non-starter, that's a hill that I'm willing to die on. I want to have that conversation. I want to raise that as a potential concern. But if that doesn't rise to the level of this person absolutely cannot have this job because it is going to be an issue, I wouldn't sit there as an investor and say, I'm going to veto this or collect a collection of my shareholders to veto this. So not silly, but probably not one that I would say is the be-all, end-all decision-making for the shareholder or investor level.
Mm-hmm. Karino Sugata writes in again, and he says the degradation issue with Raptor Lake has directly affected both consumers and business customers, and has also indirectly affected developers even. It took a long time for Intel to even admit any fault on their side. From a legal perspective, did Intel act reasonably? Do you think a lawsuit against them has much of a chance of success, whether from consumers or businesses? If developers lose business because users incorrectly blame them for poor stability, could they sue Intel over it? And I don't know how much you followed of this, but this was actually a very big story really throughout all of last year, where I remember actually late 2023, or was it even 2022? Like, there started to be these things emerging of like the new Raptor Lake series from Intel. This was 13th, 14th gen now, of like a retailer telling me, hey, we get a lot of returns on Intel CPUs lately. And then hearing developers go public and say, we have the data, we collect telemetry, and if you have this Intel generation, the game crashes more, to the point that some developers put a warning screen when the game loaded and said, don't get mad at us, you're the one who bought this Intel CPU. And from what I heard, there was some issue with like the ring bus, which gets into an architectural discussion we can avoid, but like a component of the CPU was clocked too high with too much voltage to try to keep up with AMD's latest processors, and it was cooking the chip over time. And it seems like Intel didn't test it enough to rush it out to market, and then they caught it afterwards. And they've basically, to my memory, never really admitted there was a problem, despite putting out updates to supposedly mitigate it. Some of those mitigations actually made them break more easily. By the way, it's kind of funny, which tells you they didn't know if they accidentally made it worse. But I don't believe there's ever been a full lawsuit. And I'm wondering, like, again, if you follow that at all, and how, like, what point does this become firm lawsuit territory, and how have they really been able to avoid this? It seems like it's not a mainstream thing, but it does seem like anyone in like my circles knows about this issue and won't stop talking about it.
Well, I guess my question as a follow-up would be, who is the plaintiff who wants to sue Intel in this question? Because that's going to matter as to whether or not a lawsuit could succeed.
So yeah, I have to be careful here because some of this gets into like the sources that talk to me at some game developers. But I think the number one thing you would say is there are multiple developers that would use Intel, believe it or not just like the big server chips, but they will use these pseudo gaming chips or even literal gaming chips repurposed in a server motherboard because they clock to 6 gigahertz, which if you're running certain servers for online play, maybe you just want a really fast core for low latency for the gamers. And so like there's some studios that I heard about, and some of this is public, like hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on these server chips, or these chips that were used in servers, I should say, that broke over and over and over, and Intel wouldn't honor warranty. So there's that side of it.
Okay.
And then the other side I would say is probably OEMs, because I hear like, people who work at Best Buys, they get a ton of returns of Intel laptops, and I wonder at what point they're mad, and if the only reason they're not suing Intel is they don't want to ruin the relationship with Intel.
Yeah, and that's certainly a possibility, right? Anybody that has a long-running or high-volume relationship is going to have a bigger threshold that, from a business perspective, they're going to need to reach before they decide to go through the legal process. From the developer standpoint, the people running servers, I mean, the question is always whether something is defective. Right. When we talk about products liability as a set of laws, different jurisdictions have different products liability laws on the books. But the definition of defective is going to be what's applicable here. Does it work? Does it not work? And then from there, did it damage you in some way? Did it start a fire? Did it bring down your warehouse or your location? Did it create just reputational damage in some way? And so these lawsuits can be difficult to bring because it's hard to prove exactly what happened and how this specific part of it caused the harm to you. But it's also the case that, unfortunately, all legal processes break down to resource management, right? It's the chip stack at the table, and Intel or any of these other giant companies are going to be able to put a lot of their resources on their side of the table in order to defend against a lawsuit like this one. So you got to be really sure that you want to bring it. So you've got the reputational bulwark preventing you from potentially litigating against a partner in whatever endeavor you're pursuing. And then you've got the fact that Intel, Microsoft, any other big giant multinational corporation is going to be well-resourced in the defense. And so it takes a big threshold of problems to get you to the courthouse door on any of these things. And that's the truth. I know that that's not a particularly satisfying truth. I don't know, that doesn't ring the bells of justice for most people. But essentially, when I'm advising my clients on the question of, should I sue them over this, one of the things I have to ask is, how willing are you to burn this bridge? How were you harmed? If we've got a good case and you can prove it, that's great. But do you want to go through the whole legal process here? And this is what they're going to do to you. Do you have a completely clean record in your contractual relationship? Is there something they could countersue on? All of this stuff comes into play on that question. So it becomes a lot harder than just, were you wronged? Right. I see this most often on the internet with respect to defamation. You see people making
I had to deal with that last year. Like, not
people making accusations across each other, and then like folks coming out and saying, well, if he was wrong, they'd sue him. It's like there are 1,000 reasons why you don't sue, even if you were lied about. And a good lawyer is going to sit across their desk from you and tell you about those reasons for your specific case. I feel the same way when we talk about corporate lawsuits. There's a lot of reasons why you don't sue. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the other party didn't commit a wrong.
Yeah. And I guess what I would say with regards to the Intel thing then is obviously I heard about Intel going hand in hat and saying we'll give you chips for free or we'll do this little bit of that. And we'll try to give you a better deal. So I guess my answer after listening to what you said would probably be I mean, ultimately these parties, like, was any consumer harmed enough that they can really sue over their laptop breaking in a year instead of 3 years? That's kind of hard to prove without a big class action one. And how do you prove that? From the OEM and developer side, did Intel get enough of the big players to kind of shrug it off enough that they maybe still aren't happy with the situation, right? But they don't think it's worth burning their relationship with Intel over it, right?
That's right. And if it's a continuing contract and relationship, you can extract certain concessions, as you just suggested, from the next go around of the contract, that you don't wind up having to go sue over that money because you're going to get a discount. You're going to get some kind of preferred service in the next go around because the other side knows that they didn't do what they said they were going to do under the last contract. So you do see that a lot as well.
Mm-hmm. Quick Jumper writes in and says, why would TSMC consider a deal to acquire or utilize Intel's manufacturing facilities in the U.S. when they're already investing billions in their own U.S. manufacturing plants in the U.S.? Wouldn't it be more efficient for TSMC to continue their independent expansion within the United States rather than taking on Intel's facilities? And who is actually making these claims about a TSMC Intel facing facility deal? These rumors seem as far-fetched as speculation about an Intel AMD merger. Well, on that last part, I'll just add, I mean, Reuters has claimed at a minimum they have several sources at both companies saying this or something. So I choose to believe that they're not lying about this. That seems like an odd thing to just make up. But I wonder what you think about this question.
Well, I don't know the details of the rumor, but I will say that there are definitely situations where it makes more sense to invest or purchase something that is already operational, fully running, than it is to continue your own build out, whether or not that's a problem with that build out or whether it's just expense and logistics management. You think about this on a more consumer basis. Sometimes it makes more sense to go try to buy a house than build a house. And that can be a function of both what you want to do, what your appetite for going through contractors and subcontractors is, and you just imagine how big that is for a factory build, and or what appears on the market and at what price. If there are locations that are operational and are at an economical price that you didn't expect to be there, then you can change your strategy. And maybe that's not a great idea in a given circumstance, but it's a great idea in a different one. And so without the details, it's a little hard to say, other than to say, just because I'm engaged in a build out
Right.
doesn't mean that I would necessarily turn aside a deal that made sense for me for something that's already up and running or ready to be up and running.
Right. Especially because, I mean, clearly, the U.S. is at least trying, or the current administration of the U.S. is trying to move more manufacturing to the U.S. And here's a bunch more of that. But I think on top of that, also, I think something people forget as well is like getting the people to do the thing is half of it. Like TSMC, this has been widely reported in the news too, has had trouble hiring enough people to run their new plants in the United States because they have, I mean, I'll say it, different working standards in Taiwan than the US. They might get paid reasonably well compared to the rest of, Asia at TSMC, but they're told to work 80-hour work weeks if something's wrong. And I know the people at the Intel plants work very hard as well, but I guess that's what I'm getting to is it's like finding enough of these people to work at the clean rooms. And like, this is a very specific set of skills. It's been very hard for TSMC. If they could just buy an Intel plant, maybe those workers are already there, ready to go as well. And maybe could help them facilitate some sort of merged culture with their other plants as well, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's a whole host of things that could be already up and running that could be useful to your overall strategic initiative. I definitely think that the message I would convey on this is, again, just that the fact that you're working on your own thing doesn't mean that you turn askance if you're offered an opportunity that you think could be strategically beneficial. That doesn't mean that it's the right call for any given company. People make mistakes. Like I just said, it's people all the way down, administrations and corporations. But it doesn't mean just because you're building out your own thing that you would just avoid any other potential prospective purchase.
Yeah. And then, so let's see here. Nicholas Buckner writes and it says, what would the likelihood be of regulators allowing AMD to buy the design or patent side, really any part, I would say, of Intel? Again, this was something that I think we would have brought up if you were on last year is there's all these rumors of like really everyone considering buying Intel. I think there were rumors of Samsung, I was told. Apple, of course, was some part. I saw rumors of like the Department of Defense allegedly asking AMD if they were pushed to buy Intel, would AMD do that? Like if the US government would help facilitate it. Like how do you see like this being allowed to happen? Because you could argue this becomes a monopoly if AMD buys Intel.
Yeah, I think there's two competing forces here. Again, I know I hate to lawyer all these answers, but the first is that we're clearly in a different regulatory environment than we were even with Microsoft a couple years ago. And so most deals, I think, are going to be a little bit more likely to proceed without regulatory intervention. On the other hand, when we talk about technology companies like this one, this is an area of significantly more sensitivity than publishing video games was. Right. One of the reasons that I reacted like I did when we were talking about Activision Blizzard King is that this was a really unusual thing, an unusual place for the regulators to really plant their flag. When we talk about companies that make chips, that make our electronics as we know them today, the governments of the world tend to react much, much more aggressively on these kinds of questions. So I think regulators would likely at least take a look, if not a second look, at anything that looked like a merger or an acquisition. But I can't promise that they'd actually try to stop it. It would depend on a whole host of things, including what the market looked like at that moment in time.
Okay. Carbon Cry writes in and says, how do you read the ongoing legal warfare between Qualcomm and ARM? It seems ARM is trying to monopolize ARM's server CPU merchant silicon by buying Ampere, trying to kill Orion core architecture, and broadly even core design, trying to kill Orion and pulling back on the architecture licenses. Will we see ARM achieve this monopoly? Or is it more likely ARM will be forced to open up its license as Qualcomm wants or needs them to?
This is the same kind of question that we just answered, which is to say, I think when we talk about ARM, this is an area where regulators are going to be of high levels of concern. And so it seems more likely to me that they're going to impose some kind of rule set on acquisitions and potential monopolization of that particular market. But I'm purely speculating here. And there is substantially less appetite on the regulatory side, especially in the United States, than there was even a few years ago. But this is one area where we saw basically total agreement across the regulatory bodies of preventing monopolization of these kinds of patents and intellectual property.
Yeah.
So I would suspect that to continue.
Sheriff Lotfi writes in, he says, hello, I hope you are both well. I wanted to ask from a legal perspective regarding the 12VH power cable, as it is clearly a fire hazard. Well, in court, they would say that's, well, what would they say if I said that? Would there be an objection that I said it's clearly a fire hazard?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't be allowed to present that as
Conjecture.
evidence.
Right.
Yes, you need an expert to say that for you.
But he says, with many customers reporting the burning cables from 40 and 50 series cards, I'd say melting, burning's a different thing. Tech YouTubers have also reported on the situation a great deal. How hasn't there been a lawsuit filed against Nvidia for such a cable, especially with the 5090 and the RTX 6000 Pro being 575 watts and 600 watts? Yes, that's how much energy some of these graphics cards are using on their own now, by the way, like 3 times the PS5. And judging from the 5090, it regularly goes higher than 575 watts on a cable rated to handle up to 600 watts. And so just to catch you up too, I don't know how much you looked into this before we recorded, but like this really started with the arguably actually the 3090 Ti, but the 4090 certainly in 2022, where some cables were melting. Basically, Nvidia has this new cable standard where usually, I mean, I won't reach over. I could actually maybe pull one up. There's cables about this big of an opening. They are built to carry 150 watts or more if you're out of spec, but usually you can. And Nvidia made one half as big that can carry over 600 watts. A lot of that's from requiring much better materials. A lot of that seems to be lighter tolerances as well. And there have been $2,000 plus graphics cards that have melted because of this. Although last generation, there was probably a decent amount of people that were unplugging and plugging it in so often to check it that they probably caused it to break and melt, and it was maybe their fault. But I don't want anyone to get mad at me that had their cable melt. But it's always felt like this is a thing people won't stop talking about in the enthusiast gaming community. But at the same time, it never seems like half of the people have had them melt. So I wonder what you think about this, though.
Well, from a legal perspective, this is, again, a products liability kind of question. So at least as you describe it, you might have a case for a defect in design. rather than a defect in manufacture. Usually when we talk about defects, it's something went wrong and there's a hole in whatever needs to be, not having a hole. But if it's a defect in design, that's a bigger potential case for something like a class action plaintiff's firm. So if you were going to see something move forward at a consumer price level, and I know these things are higher than that at some level very often, but for most consumer goods, you're going to have to collect a lot of plaintiffs at the same time for it to make sense for any kind of legal fight on these types of issues. So the fight at that point would be that essentially it was designed defectively. Like from the moment that it was put together in this way, it was designed in a manner that was likely to break down in a way that a reasonable consumer would not expect. And different jurisdictions have those different products liability laws. But as a concept, that's the framework.
Now, here's an interesting wrinkle, by the way. They have revised the cable since then with new specifications that seems to cause it to melt a lot less often from the original ones they sold.
And that's the part where you get into potential exposure of liability at the corporate level, right? This is one of those areas where you hear about those board meetings where they decide not to fix something. The reason they decide not to fix it is because when you do fix it, it starts to look like you have admitted that there was a problem in the design to begin with. And so that could be used as a piece of evidence in a court case that says, okay, it was a defect in design. You might not have realized it at the time. It's not an intentional attempt to burn my computer or house to the ground, but you realized it at this point, and now we're going to sue you for those folks that bought it before you fixed it. And that's the kind of thing that can work. But you need a plaintiff's class action kind of firm. You need to get together a sympathetic plaintiff that had something really bad happen to them usually from this, and that goes together, and then you get that email 6 months later that says you might be entitled to 39 cents or whatever it might be from the giant class action. And that's how that would look in practice. Outside of that, that's how I would see that playing out. It's the kind of thing that can be a consumer electronics type of lawsuit. And there are certainly plaintiffs' firms that are willing to have that conversation. We saw it a lot with respect to things that were less dangerous, like Joy-Con drift with the Switch, for instance. And so if you look at the Joy-Con drift class action, that's the last one that I can think of. Yeah. You'll see a plaintiff's firm look for a sympathetic plaintiff. You'll see them collect those plaintiffs in order to try to go extract concessions from Nintendo. That's the kind of thing you'd be looking at with the addition of fire, which is always fun in court.
Yeah, well, and not, again, to minimize people that did have this issue, which it does legitimately seem like there have been at least dozens, if not hundreds, of people that have had this issue. But that's out of hundreds of thousands of graphics cards, if not millions, that have been sold. I mean, you would agree that there's lawyers looking to do business, and if they couldn't get enough people for a large class action, that would probably be a major component as to why it hasn't happened.
Yes, I think that's right. If they couldn't find that sympathetic plaintiff, if they didn't think they could make a good enough case, then that's you could have people pursuing that and then just getting essentially rejected at that level. That happens behind the scenes. We don't get that in the news. But yes, of course, if it's not happening, there are a number of reasons why it might not be happening. And one of them is that you can't make the case.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that is all the subjects that I had to discuss with you today. I really want to thank you for coming on again. I think this was a fantastic discussion, actually. I'm sure I will invite you on once again at some point in the future, as I'm sure you would agree. There's not going to be a slowdown in legal questions, I believe, in the foreseeable future. But please tell everybody where they can find you, and plug anything you want to.
Yeah, so I think most regularly right now, I'm on Last Stand Media in various forms. I've been on Summon Signs and Constellation episodes for folks that aren't familiar with that particular brand. That is the gaming podcast and then the general conversational podcast where I talked about my love of stories and which medium tells the best stories, etc. So that's a good conversation that I highly recommend. But I'm also in my own land of YouTube making virtual legality episodes, including about various actions of the current administration, but primarily focused on video game and technology related questions, as well as Hangouts and Headlines, where I talk generally in live stream format about media issues of our day and how they're reporting on various things so that we can hopefully critically read the way these things are reported on together and have a better understanding of what's actually happening. Some journalists are better than others at that. And so you can see that at Hoeg Law on YouTube, at Last Stand Media through Patreon or on their YouTube channel. And then I'm also co-hosting the Bitcast for Seasoned Gaming on my channel and the Seasoned Gaming channel simulcast every Sunday morning. I love to do all that stuff. And I'm also running a law firm in between all that. That's not really going to hit your desk likelihood.
Well,
But
if you're in Michigan.
if you do have small business questions, well, I have clients all over the country, not so many outside the United States, but I can practice in Michigan. I can still help you out. If you've got a small business, contract needs, other things, I help form and fund businesses across this great land of ours. And if you're interested in that, yes, you can find me at hoeglaw.com as a website. So please do let me know. I look forward to seeing you. I love this conversation. You tested me a couple of times. There's a lot of substance there. And I apologize, I guess, in arrears for lawyering so many of my answers because there's so many details that go into so much of this.
I think it was a good conversation. And I will have links, of course, to your law firm and your YouTube channel below as well, so people can easily find that. So look for that. And then, of course, I will also pimp myself out here at the end too. Make sure that you like the video, share, comment below, check out our sponsors if you want any of their products, or if you don't, please at least just click on their links. Let's be honest. And also, please make sure you're subscribed to Moore's Law is Dead YouTube channel. Ring the bell button there. Support Moore's Law is Dead on Patreon, where you'll get access to Ask Guests like Hoeg questions, bonus content like Die Shrink, access to a Discord. There's free reader mail for other podcasts and live streams as well. There's a whole ton of content there. It starts at just $2 a month. And as always, everybody, please show mercy on us. I have no doubt that the news might change by the time this comes out, but hopefully the points we make are the things you noodle on to think about how to digest the new news that may make everything we've said outdated. And yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and have a good week, everybody. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugad as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page in the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guests questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are
at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels.
Brad Medlin, Drita Full, Zegis, Daniel D, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, Aaron Close, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, MJB1, GZ Ziggy, Toka, SNES Chalmers, Jem Ferriero, Valcom Alev, Jensen Wang, Gregorius Acker, Sarcastro, Chris Trick, Evan Dingle, Compressed AI Blocks, Halbuma, Shredburb, Sammy Malas, Jordan Simkovic, The Boss Haas, Chrysantine, Jonathan, Neithra Zink, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Zlicky, Meat and Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Gamers Unite, Mad, Zoot Suit Taylor, Greg, Michael McGee, Patty Cake, Stephen Coates, Amiable Chief, Mark Mitchell, Tommy, Aisha, James Anderson, Mark Raidmaker, Cole Atta, Cameron, Henry Zhang, Wesley Sager, Michelle Pell, Hexa Puma, Winwang, Reginald Ari, Teak Autumn, Windstar, Corey Leonard, James I. Raider, Little Germany, Shay, Milton, Melodic Warrior, Brett Jones, Chuck Glidden, Mac Daffy, Stephen Dick, Justin Bustle, Austin Haggerty, Joe Foot, Brian Scanlon, Hardland, Jansen Angima, Joseph Kelly, Slushpaw, Himsa Gung, Tails 2299, Brian Wright, Sisyphos 7771, The Forbidden Juice, Jeffrey Gentleman, RB Racer, Alex Vega, Dr. J Mad, Freedy, Michael Cozy, John Swin, Thalo 215, Crystal Joe, Elbert Gun, Keekum Solarize 80 Sprutnik, Brian P, Whodat 42, Cornster 671, Penta Winta, Hal Richard Omega Doge, Mr. Tigle, John with Boomstick, Hugo Ender Kiwi, Penguins, Love AI, Porcelain Oat, State Farm Snake, Curry King 3, Nick Zuzmania, Sakosha 37 by 73, Rye Hill, Cheap Bowls, Sheriff Lotfi, Kevin Coots, Smash Axley, Armand Vakatura, Jonathan Harris, Kareem El Masari, Callan Reichel, and of course, Angel of Cake, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.